mid-1960s, the People's Republic of China appeared to be emerging from its darkest hour. The catastrophic famine caused by the Great Leap Forward had finally subsided, and the nation was enjoying a period of relative economic stability. Under the day-to-day administration of President Liu Shaoqi and General Secretary Deng Xiaoping, the radical policies of the previous decade had been rolled back. Private farming had been partially restored, and technical expertise was once again valued over political fervor. To the outside observer, it seemed that the Chinese Communist Party had learned from its mistakes and was settling into a pattern of rational governance. However, Chairman Mao Zedong viewed this recovery with deep suspicion. Where others saw stability, Mao saw decay. He believed that the party was sliding into revisionism, a term he used to describe the abandonment of true revolutionary ideals in favor of comfort, bureaucracy, and capitalist incentives. He looked at the Soviet Union, which was undergoing a process of de-Stalinization, and feared that China was following the same trajectory. Mao was convinced that a new class of privileged bureaucrats had emerged within the party, men who were nominally communist but were actually taking the capitalist road. Mao's anxiety was rooted in a question of legacy. He feared that the next generation of Chinese citizens who had not experienced the hardships of the Long March or the Civil War would lose their revolutionary spirit. He believed that if the status quo continued, the Chinese Revolution would die with him. To prevent this, he determined that a massive upheaval was necessary to purify the party and the nation. Since the party apparatus itself was the source of the problem, Mao concluded that he could not use the existing government machinery to conduct this purge. Instead, he decided to bypass the political hierarchy entirely and appeal directly to the masses to bombard the headquarters. The movement that emerged from this decision was the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Spanning from 1966 to 1976, this decade represented a total rejection of the established order. It was a period characterized by the weaponization of the youth. High school and university students were encouraged to revolt against all forms of authority, including their teachers, their parents, and local party officials. The scope of the chaos was total. The education system was paralyzed as schools and universities closed their doors for years. Industrial production faltered as factories became battlegrounds for warring political factions. The cultural heritage of China, spanning thousands of years, came under direct attack as mobs sought to destroy the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Historic temples were smashed, books were burned, and intellectuals were publicly humiliated or beaten to death. For 10 years, the machinery of the state effectively ceased to function, replaced by a volatile atmosphere of paranoia, violence, and the intense personality cult of the chairman. It was a civil war of the mind that traumatized an entire generation. Part 1. The Spark, Hai Rui and the May 16th notification. The origins of the Cultural Revolution can be traced to an academic debate regarding a piece of historical theatre. In the early 1960s, Wu Han, a renowned historian and the deputy mayor of Beijing, wrote a play titled Hai Rui Dismissed from Office. The play was set in the Ming dynasty and told the story of an honest official, Hai Rui, who criticized the emperor for neglecting his duties and was subsequently removed from his post. When the play was first performed, in 1961, it was praised by the Communist Party leadership. It was seen as a call for officials to be honest and to speak the truth to power. However, by 1965, the political context had shifted dramatically. Chairman Mao Zedong and his radical allies began to interpret the play as a veiled political allegory attacking the chairman. In this interpretation, the honest official Hai Rui represented Marshal Peng Dehuai, the defense minister who had been purged in 1959 for criticizing the Great Leap Forward. Consequently, the corrupt emperor in the play represented Mao himself. Mao Zedong decided to use this play as the wedge to crack open the Beijing political establishment. He believed that the Beijing Municipal Party Committee, led by the powerful Mayor Peng Zhen, had become a watertight kingdom that was impervious to his influence. To launch his attack, Mao turned to his wife, Jiang Qing. A former actress with deep grievances against the party elite who had sidelined her for years, Jiang Qing traveled to Shanghai, which was the base of the radical faction. There, she collaborated with a polemicist named Yao Wenyuan. On November 10, 1965, a Shanghai newspaper published an article by Yao Wenyuan titled "On the New Historical Play, Hai Rui Dismissed from Office." The article was a scathing attack on Wuhan, labeling the play a poisonous weed that sought to reverse the verdict on the enemies of the party. The publication of this article sparked a fierce internal struggle. The Beijing leadership, led by Peng Zhen, attempted to contain the damage. They tried to frame the discussion as a purely academic debate about historical accuracy rather than a political struggle. In February 1966, Peng Zhen issued a report known as the February Outline, which instructed the media to limit the criticism to academic matters and to avoid political purges. Mao Zedong rejected this approach entirely. He viewed the February Outline as proof that the Beijing authorities were protecting bourgeois intellectuals and opposing the revolution. From his retreat in Hangzhou, Mao orchestrated the dismantling of Peng Zhen and his allies. In early May 1966, an expanded meeting of the Politburo was held in Beijing. During this meeting, Peng Zhen and other senior officials were accused of anti-party crimes and stripped of their posts. This meeting culminated in the issuance of a document on May 16, 1966, known simply as the May 16th Notification. This document is widely considered to be the formal declaration of the start of the Cultural Revolution. The text of the notification, revised by Mao himself, was filled with alarming and violent rhetoric. It revoked the February Outline and declared that the party had been infiltrated by revisionists. The notification warned that representatives of the bourgeoisie had sneaked into the party, the government, the army, and various spheres of culture. It stated that these people were counter-revolutionary revisionists who would seize power and turn the dictatorship of the proletariat into a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Crucially, Mao added a chilling sentence: "Some of them we have already seen through, others we have not. Some are still trusted by us and are being trained as our successors. Persons like Khrushchev, for example, who are still nestling beside us." This reference to Khrushchev's nestling beside us was a direct threat to the second-in-command, President Liu Shaoqi, and General Secretary Deng Xiaoping, though they were not yet named publicly. The May 16th notification effectively dissolved the existing cultural apparatus and established a new body to direct the movement, the Central Cultural Revolution Group. The Cultural Revolution Group, or CRG, quickly became the most powerful political organ in the country, effectively eclipsing the Politburo and the Secretariat. It was reported directly to the Standing Committee, but operated with significant autonomy. The group was comprised of Mao's most trusted radical allies. It was led by Chen Boda, Mao's longtime political secretary and ideologue. Jiang Qing served as the first deputy head, acting as the group's public face and enforcer. Other key members included Kang Sheng, the feared head of the security services, and Zhang Chongqiao, a radical theorist from Shanghai. This group would serve as the command center for the chaos that was about to engulf the nation. With a high-level political purge underway, Mao sought to ignite a movement at the grassroots level. He looked for a spark to mobilize the students. He found it at Peking University, often referred to as Beida, the most prestigious educational institution in China. Tensions had been building at Peking University for months. The university was controlled by a party committee led by Liu Ping, who was closely aligned with the now disgraced Beijing municipal leadership. On the other side of the divide was Ni Yuanzi, the party secretary of the philosophy department. Ni was a radical leftist who felt marginalized by the university administration. Sensing the changing political winds following the May 16th notification, Ni and 6 of her colleagues decided to strike. On May 25, 1966, Ni Yuanzi and her co-authors pasted a large sheet of paper covered in writing onto a wall near the university dining hall. This was a dazibao, or big character poster. In China, these posters were a traditional method of public protest and debate, used to air grievances or make political statements. The language of the poster was incendiary. It accused the university president Liu Ping and his administration of suppressing the student movement and acting as a black gang, loyal to the revisionist line. It called on the students and faculty to resolutely, thoroughly, clean, and totally eliminate all evil habits and to smash the black gang. Initially, the university administration tried to suppress the poster. They organized students to tear it down and criticized Ni Yuanzi for disrupting order. However, a copy of the poster was transmitted to Mao Zedong. The chairman saw in this poster exactly what he had been looking for, a spontaneous uprising from below against the party bureaucracy. On June 1, 1966, Mao ordered the text of Ni Yuanzi's poster to be broadcast on national radio. He hailed it as China's first Marxist-Leninist, big-character poster. The impact of this endorsement was immediate and electric. By broadcasting the poster, Mao sent a clear signal to every student in China: rebellion was justified. The chairman supported the students against their teachers and their school administrators. Within days, classes at Peking University came to a halt. Students swarmed the campus, writing thousands of their own big-character posters and pasting them over every available surface, walls, corridors, and even the floors. The criticism sessions moved from paper to physical reality. Students dragged Lu Ping and other university officials out of their offices. They forced them to wear dunce caps, knelt them on the ground, and subjected them to struggle sessions, where they were verbally abused and physically beaten. The events at Peking University rippled outward with terrifying speed. Following the radio broadcasts, students at high schools and universities across Beijing and then the rest of the country began to rise up against their own school authorities. The hierarchy of respect for teachers, a cornerstone of Chinese society for millennia, was shattered overnight. Teachers were accused of poisoning the minds of the youth with bourgeois ideas. To manage this exploding movement, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping tried to implement the traditional party control mechanism. They dispatched work teams, groups of party cadres, into the schools to direct the students and keep the criticism within acceptable limits. They hoped to manage the Cultural Revolution just as they had managed previous political campaigns. Mao, however, had no intention of letting the party apparatus control a movement designed to destroy it. He remained away from Beijing, watching the situation develop, allowing the tension between the radical students and the conservative work teams to reach a boiling point. The stage was set for the summer of 1966, a season that would see the formation of the Red Guards and the descent of the capital into total anarchy. Part 2. Red August and the Destruction of the Four Olds. In late July 1966, Mao Zedong returned to Beijing from his retreat in the south. His return signaled the end of the attempt by the party moderates to manage the growing student unrest. Mao immediately criticized the work teams sent by Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, accusing them of suppressing the revolutionary masses and implementing a white terror. On August 5, 1966, Mao published his own big-character poster entitled "Bombard the Headquarters." In this short text, he explicitly targeted the central leadership of the party, urging the people to overthrow the bourgeois headquarters that had entrenched itself within the state apparatus. With the party hierarchy paralyzed, the students were unleashed. They organized themselves into paramilitary units known as the Red Guards. At this early stage, membership in the Red Guards was strictly determined by a concept known as bloodline theory. This theory held that a person's political reliability was determined biologically by the class status of their father. A popular couplet among the students declared, "The son of a hero is a good man, the son of a reactionary is a rotten egg." Based on this, students were divided into two caste systems. The 5 red categories consisted of children of poor peasants, workers, revolutionary soldiers, revolutionary cadres, and revolutionary martyrs. These students were the elite, the only ones initially allowed to wear the red armband. Conversely, the 5 black categories included the children of landlords, rich peasants, counter-revolutionaries, bad elements, and rightists. These students were marginalized, excluded, and frequently became the first targets of abuse. The movement required a public inauguration. This occurred on August 18, 1966, a date that marks the beginning of the period known as Red August. A massive rally was organized in Tiananmen Square. Over 1 million students from across the country gathered in the vast plaza, waving copies of the Little Red Book, a collection of quotations from Chairman Mao that had been compiled by the army. When Mao Zedong appeared on the rostrum of the Gate of Heavenly Peace, the crowd erupted into hysteria. Significantly, Mao was not wearing his usual grey tunic. Instead, he was dressed in the olive-green uniform of the People's Liberation Army. This was a powerful visual signal. The chairman was declaring war. During the rally, a specific interaction took place that would define the ethos of the movement. A teenage student leader named Song Binbin was selected to pin a Red Guard armband onto Mao's sleeve. Song Binbin was a student at the experimental high school attached to Beijing Normal University and the daughter of Song Renchong, a founding general of the People's Republic. She was a quintessential member of the 5 red categories. When she placed the armband on Mao, the chairman asked her name. She replied, "Song Binbin." The characters for Binbin mean refined or gentle. Mao looked at her and remarked, "Be violent," or in some translations, "be martial." The implication was that the revolution had no place for gentleness. Following this encounter, Song changed her name to Song Yaowu, which translates to "wanted marshal." The state media publicized this story extensively. It was a direct instruction from the highest authority in the land that violence was not only creating the revolution, but was a virtue in itself. Empowered by the chairman, the Red Guards turned their attention to the destruction of the Four Olds. This campaign aimed to eradicate old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. In the eyes of the radicals, Chinese society was still cluttered with the remnants of feudalism and capitalism that were holding back the socialist utopia. The campaign began with a frantic attempt to rename the physical world. In Beijing, street signs were torn down and replaced with revolutionary names. The road in front of the Soviet embassy was renamed Anti-Revisionist Street. Legation Street, a symbol of foreign imperialism, became Anti-Imperialist Road. Shops that bore traditional names were forced to change them to titles like East is Red or Worker, Peasant, Soldier. The Red Guards took over the streets, setting up checkpoints to inspect the appearance of passers-by. They carried scissors to cut the hair of those with Hong Kong-style haircuts or to slash the legs of trousers that were deemed too tight. Women wearing high heels had the heels chopped off. It was a war on aesthetics, where any deviation from a drab proletarian uniformity was viewed as a sign of bourgeois decadence. However, the destruction of the Four Olds quickly moved from the streets into private homes. The Red Guards launched a campaign of house raids. Armed with information from local police stations or neighborhood committees, groups of teenage students broke into the homes of people labeled as class enemies, intellectuals, or former capitalists. They ransacked these houses in search of feudal items. The scale of cultural destruction was immense. Ancient scrolls of calligraphy were ripped to shreds. Porcelain vases from the Ming and Qing dynasties were smashed with hammers. Libraries of rare books were thrown into bonfires on the street. In Shanghai alone, it is estimated that over 100,000 homes were raided during this period. The objective was to sever the link between the Chinese people and their history. This iconoclasm extended to the nation's most sacred heritage sites. The most prominent example was the attack on Qufu, the hometown of Confucius. In November 1966, a Red Guard leader from Beijing Normal University named Tan Hulan led a force of students to Qufu. They were acting with the implicit support of the Cultural Revolution group in Beijing. For weeks, they occupied the Confucius Temple, the Cemetery of Confucius, and the Kong family mansion. These sites had been preserved for over 2,000 years by successive dynasties. The Red Guards smashed the massive stone stelae that recorded the history of the temple. They burned ancient woodblock prints and statues. In a final act of desecration, they dug up the grave of the 76th descendant of Confucius, dragging his corpse out and hanging it from a tree. This was a symbolic declaration that the Confucian value system, which emphasized hierarchy, scholarship, and respect for elders, was dead. As August turned to September, the violence escalated from the destruction of objects to the destruction of human beings. The primary targets were teachers and school administrators. The education system was viewed as the breeding ground for bourgeois thinking. Students, encouraged by the state media, turned on their educators. The first recorded fatality of the Red Guard movement in Beijing occurred on August 5, 1966, at the same school attended by Song Binbin. The victim was Bian Zhongyun, the vice principal of the school. Bian was a 50-year-old mother of 4 and a loyal party member. However, she had been targeted by rebel students who accused her of being a capitalist rhoder. Bian Zhongyun was subjected to a brutal struggle session. Students beat her with wooden sticks nailed with spikes. They poured ink over her head and forced her to carry heavy bricks. After hours of torture, she collapsed and died. The hospital, fearing the Red Guards, hesitated to treat her. Her death set a precedent. Murder in the name of the revolution would go unpunished. In the weeks that followed, a wave of terror washed over Beijing. This period is known as Red August. Thousands of people were beaten to death. The victims were often humiliated before they were killed. A common method of torture was the jet plane position, where the victim was forced to bend forward at the waist with their arms wrenched behind their back like wings, often for hours at a time. The violence was facilitated by the complete withdrawal of legal protection. The Minister of Public Security, Xie Fuji, issued a directive to the police force stating that they should not intervene in Red Guard activities. He famously told police commanders, "If people are beaten to death, it is none of our business." He argued that checking the violence would be akin to pouring cold water on the revolutionary enthusiasm of the masses. The police provided the Red Guards with the addresses of the 5 black categories. In the Daxing district, a suburb of Beijing, the violence reached a genocidal pitch. Between August 27th and September 1st, over 300 people were massacred. In some villages, the Red Guards sought to exterminate entire families of landlords, killing everyone from the elderly grandparents to the infants in order to pull up the roots. The psychological toll on the intellectual class was devastating. Many of China's most prominent writers and artists, seeing their life's work destroyed and their dignity stripped away, chose to end their own lives. Lao She, one of the most celebrated novelists of the 20th century, was dragged from his home and beaten by Red Guards at the Temple of Confucius in Beijing. The following day, he walked to Taiping Lake and drowned himself. He was one of hundreds of intellectuals who committed suicide in Beijing during August and September 1966. By the autumn of 1966, the chaos in Beijing had spread to the rest of the country. The central government encouraged this diffusion by allowing students free travel on the railway network. This was known as the Great Link-Up. Millions of Red Guards traveled to Beijing to see Chairman Mao and then returned to their provinces to ignite the revolution locally. They brought with them the tactics of the struggle session and the ideology of the Four Olds. The railway system choked under the pressure of 11 million students crisscrossing the nation. They transformed the passenger carriages into mobile dormitories and propaganda centers. As they arrived in provincial capitals like Shanghai, Wuhan, and Chengdu, they clashed with local party committees who were terrified of suffering the same fate as the Beijing leadership. The initial phase of the Cultural Revolution was defined by this vertical attack, the youth attacking the establishment above them. However, as 1966 came to a close, the movement began to fracture horizontally. The Red Guards were not a unified army. As the 5 black category students began to form their own rebel groups to protect themselves, and as workers began to join the fray, the movement splintered into thousands of rival factions. The stage was set for the next phase of the tragedy, where the violence would shift from beatings and struggle sessions to full-scale urban warfare involving heavy weaponry. The genie of chaos was out of the bottle, and not even Mao Zedong could fully control where it would go next. Part 3. Total Chaos and the Wuhan Incident. As the calendar turned to 1967, the nature of the Cultural Revolution underwent a fundamental shift. What had begun as a student movement confined to university campuses and high schools now spilled over into the industrial heart of China. Mao Zedong, dissatisfied with the pace of the purge, encouraged the working class to join the rebellion. This decision removed the last guardrails that had kept the Chinese economy functioning. The epicenter of this new phase was Shanghai, the industrial capital of the nation. In late 1966, a new rebel organization emerged among the city's factory workers, led by a young, charismatic textile worker named Wang Hongwen. This group, known as the Workers' General Headquarters, challenged the authority of the existing Shanghai municipal government. In January 1967, the situation in Shanghai collapsed into anarchy. The rebel workers seized control of the city's newspapers, the railway network, and the port. Vital supplies were cut off, and the city's administration ceased to function. On January 5th, Wang Hongwen and his followers formally overthrew the Shanghai Municipal Party Committee. This event, known as the January Storm, was a watershed moment. It was the first time in the history of the People's Republic that the communist government itself was toppled from below by the very proletariat it claimed to represent. Mao Zedong enthusiastically endorsed the coup. He held up the January Storm as a model for the rest of the country. He issued a new directive: proletarian revolutionaries, unite and seize power from the handful of party persons in authority taking the capitalist road. This directive effectively authorized a nationwide power grab. In every province and major city, disparate rebel groups rushed to storm government offices and declare themselves the new masters of the region. However, this created an immediate and bloody problem. There was rarely just one rebel group. In any given city, there were often dozens of different Red Guard and worker factions. They all claimed to be the true followers of Chairman Mao, and they all denounced their rivals as counter-revolutionaries. When the old government structures were dissolved, there was no longer a recognized authority to mediate between these groups. The result was factional warfare. The weapons of choice escalated rapidly. In the early days of 1966, the violence had been committed with belts, fists, and wooden clubs. By the summer of 1967, the factions were arming themselves with stolen military hardware. They raided police stations, militia armories, and even trains carrying supplies for the Vietnam War. The streets of major cities like Chongqing and Guangzhou became war zones. Factions used machine guns, anti-aircraft artillery, and makeshift tanks to besiege each other's strongholds. In Chongqing, the industrial powerhouse of the southwest, rival groups bombarded each other with artillery shells across the river, reducing factories to rubble. Amidst this disintegration, the role of the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, became critical. Initially, Mao had ordered the military to support the broad masses of the left. However, since every faction claimed to be the left, the local military commanders were placed in an impossible position. If they supported one group, they automatically made enemies of the other. Many commanders, fearing for their own safety and valuing order, tended to side with the more conservative factions, groups often made up of skilled workers and party cadres who wanted to restore production, rather than the radical students who wanted endless chaos. This tension between the military and the radicals exploded in July 1967 in the city of Wuhan. This event, known as the Wuhan Incident, brought the country to the brink of a full-scale civil war and threatened the personal safety of Mao Zedong himself. Wuhan is a strategic city on the Yangtze River, a hub of heavy industry and transport. By the summer of 1967, the city was divided between two massive warring coalitions. On one side was a group called the Million Heroes. This was a conservative faction numbering nearly 500,000 members, comprised largely of skilled factory workers, state employees, and local militia. They were backed by the local military commander, General Chen Zhaidao, who viewed them as a force for stability. Opposing them was the Workers' General Headquarters, a radical coalition of students and unskilled workers who were aligned with the extremists in Beijing. They were smaller in number but fierce in their rhetoric, attacking the Million Heroes as conservative royalists. The street fighting in Wuhan had been particularly brutal, with hundreds killed in clashes involving iron bars and spears. To resolve the crisis, Mao Zedong decided to intervene personally. In mid-July, the chairman flew to Wuhan, accompanied by his premier, Zhou Enlai, and a key member of the Radical Cultural Revolution group, Wang Li. The delegation set up camp at the Meiling Villa on the banks of the East Lake. Mao's presence was kept secret for security reasons. The intention was to mediate a truce. However, the radical emissary Wang Li was arrogant and ideologically rigid. He attended a massive rally of the radical faction and publicly declared that the Million Heroes were a conservative organization and that General Chen Zhaidao was supporting the wrong side. This declaration infuriated the Million Heroes and the local soldiers. On July 20th, mutiny broke out. Soldiers from the local garrison, along with thousands of members of the Million Heroes, surrounded the Meiling Villa. They were armed with machine guns and drove trucks through the city streets, shouting slogans against Wang Li. In a shocking breach of protocol, the mutinous troops broke into the government compound where the delegation was staying. They assaulted Wang Li, dragging him out of his room and taking him to a stadium where he was brutally beaten and subjected to a struggle session. Mao Zedong, the supreme leader of China, was now trapped in a villa surrounded by hostile troops who were technically his own soldiers. It was the most dangerous moment of his life since the revolution. Zhou Enlai, who had been managing the negotiations from a different location, realized the gravity of the threat. He arranged for Mao to be evacuated immediately. The chairman was rushed to a nearby airfield and flown to Shanghai. It was a humiliating escape. The central government in Beijing reacted with fury. They viewed the Wuhan incident as a counter-revolutionary military coup. They dispatched elite airborne divisions and naval gunboats to steam up the Yangtze River to retake the city. Faced with overwhelming force, General Chen Zidao surrendered. The Million Heroes faction was dismantled, and its leaders were arrested. The aftermath of the Wuhan incident saw the violence reach its absolute peak. The radical ideologues in Beijing, particularly Mao's wife Jiang Qing, used the incident to argue that the army itself was filled with traitors. She issued a call to drag out the handful in the army. This slogan gave the Red Guards permission to attack military bases directly. In August 1967, the chaos bled into China's foreign relations. Radical students in Beijing, frustrated by the lack of pure revolutionary zeal in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, stormed the ministry building. They seized the archives and declared themselves in charge of China's diplomacy. The culmination of this diplomatic madness occurred on August 22, 1967. A mob of Red Guards surrounded the office of the British Chargé d'Affaires in Beijing. They were protesting the British colonial government's suppression of communist riots in Hong Kong. The protest turned violent. The Red Guards broke into the British compound, looted the building, and set it on fire. The British diplomats were forced to retreat to a secure room, but as the smoke filled the building, they were driven out and beaten by the mob in the garden. This violation of diplomatic immunity shocked the world and left China almost completely isolated on the international stage. Throughout this period of total disintegration, one figure worked tirelessly to prevent the complete collapse of the Chinese state: Premier Zhou Enlai. Zhou occupied a precarious position. He was the head of the government bureaucracy that the Red Guards were trying to destroy, yet he had to pledge absolute loyalty to Mao to survive. Zhou Enlai adopted the strategy of survival through compliance. He publicly shouted the radical slogans and wore the Mao badge, but privately he worked to limit the damage. He spent his days and nights in negotiations with warring factions, trying to talk them out of destroying power plants and railways. He issued orders to the military to protect specific facilities that were deemed essential for national security, such as the Lop Nur nuclear test site and the missile research centers. One of Zhou's most significant contributions was his protection of individuals. He maintained lists of key scientists, generals, and ministers who were critical to the functioning of the state. He personally intervened to move these people into military protection, or the safest parts of the government compound in Zhongnanhai. When Red Guards came to drag these people away, Zhou would often stand at the gate himself, using his immense prestige to turn the mob away or negotiating a compromise where the victim would be criticized but not physically harmed. By September 1967, even Mao Zedong began to realize that the chaos had gone too far. The attacks on the army and the seizure of weapons threatened the very existence of the regime. If the army collapsed, the Communist Party would fall with it. Mao reversed course. He authorized the military to use force to restore order and commanded the Red Guard factions to disband their great alliances and return to school. The January storm and the Wuhan incident represented the high-water mark of the popular rebellion. The masses had been unleashed and they had nearly torn the country apart. Part 4. The Mystery of Project 571 and the Fall of Lin Biao. By the summer of 1968, the factional warfare that had consumed cities like Wuhan and Chongqing had convinced Mao Zedong that the Red Guards had outlived their usefulness. The students, once hailed as the vanguard of the revolution, were now viewed as a source of instability. They had failed to unite, splintering instead into petty warlordism. To restore order, Mao turned to the only remaining functional institution in the country: the People's Liberation Army. In late July 1968, Mao dispatched worker-peasant Mao Zedong thought propaganda teams, essentially military units accompanied by loyal factory workers, to take control of the universities. At Tsinghua University in Beijing, the student radicals refused to surrender their stronghold. They fought the entering troops with spears and homemade grenades, killing 5 members of the propaganda team. Mao was furious. He summoned the student leaders to a meeting and rebuked them, telling them effectively that their time was up. To mark this shift in favor from the students to the workers, a bizarre event occurred that summer, which historians refer to as Mango Fever. On August the 4th, the Foreign Minister of Pakistan visited Beijing and presented Mao with a crate of mangoes, a fruit that was virtually unknown in northern China at the time. Mao, rather than eating them, sent the mangoes to the propaganda team at Tsinghua University as a symbolic gesture of support. The reaction was hysterical. The mangoes were treated as sacred religious relics. Workers lined up in the rain to bow before the mangoes. They were placed on altars in glass cases. When the fruit began to rot, they were peeled and boiled in massive vats of water, and the resulting sacred water was dispensed by the teaspoon to the faithful. Wax replicas were mass-produced and sent around the country. The message was clear: the workers, backed by the army, were now the chosen class. The students were discarded. To dismantle the Red Guard armies, the state launched the Up to the Mountains and Down to the Countryside movement. Beginning in late 1968, millions of urban youths were ordered to leave the cities and settle in the rural hinterlands. The official rationale was that they needed to be re-educated by the poor and lower-middle peasants. In reality, this was a massive dispersal strategy. By scattering the students across thousands of remote villages, the government broke up the violent factions. Between 1968 and the end of the movement, approximately 17 million young people were sent to the countryside. For this lost generation, the reality was harsh. They arrived in impoverished villages that had no food to spare. The urban intellectuals were often ill-equipped for back-breaking agricultural labor. Many would not see their families again for a decade. With the streets quieted, the Communist Party convened the Ninth Party Congress in April 1969 to formally declare the end of the chaotic phase of the Cultural Revolution. The Congress was a coronation for the military. With the civilian bureaucracy shattered, army officers now held nearly half of the seats on the Central Committee. The primary beneficiary of this militarization was Defense Minister Lin Biao. Lin was a frail, hypochondriac war hero who had been Mao's most sycophantic supporter. It was Lin who had compiled the Little Red Book and mandated its study in the army. At the Ninth Party Congress, Lin Biao was formally named in the new party constitution as Mao Zedong's closest comrade-in-arms and successor. To formalize the succession into constitutional law was an unprecedented move. However, history has shown that being the designated number 2 in an authoritarian regime is a dangerous position. Almost immediately after his elevation, a rift opened between Mao and Lin. Mao began to fear that the military had become too powerful. He started to maneuver against Lin's allies, using his classic tactic of throwing stones, mixing sand, and digging up the cornerstone, meaning attacking the subordinates to undermine the leader. Lin Biao, already in poor health, became increasingly passive and depressed. However, his family was ambitious. Lin's wife, Ye Chun, and his son, Lin Liguo, were deeply involved in the power struggle. Lin Liguo was a high-ranking officer in the Air Force and had built a fiercely loyal entourage known as the Joint Fleet. By 1970, the younger Lin and his circle became convinced that Mao intended to purge the Lin family just as he had purged Liu Shaoqi. They decided that their only chance of survival was a preemptive strike. In March 1971, in a secret meeting in Shanghai, they drafted a plan for an armed coup. The document they produced was titled Project 571. In Mandarin, the numbers 571 are pronounced Wu Ji Yi, which sounds identical to the phrase for armed uprising. This document, which was later recovered by the authorities, provides a stunning insight into the mindset of the High Command. The text of Project 571 was a scathing indictment of the Cultural Revolution. It described Mao Zedong as a feudal tyrant akin to the brutal emperor Qin Shi Huang. It referred to Mao by the codename B-52 after the American bomber, implying he dropped destruction from above. The document accused Mao of manufacturing contradictions and treating his political allies like sacrificial lambs. "He's a paranoid sadist," the plotters wrote. "His former secretaries have either committed suicide or been arrested." The plan discussed several methods for assassinating Mao. These included attacking his private train with flamethrowers, bombing a railway bridge, or using aircraft to strafe the chairman's residence. The opportunity for the plot arose in the summer of 1971. Mao departed Beijing for a tour of southern China. Lin Liguo and the Joint Fleet prepared to execute the assassination while Mao was in transit. However, Mao, a veteran of decades of guerrilla warfare, possessed an uncanny survival instinct. He sensed that something was wrong. He noticed that local officials loyal to Lin were acting strangely. Mao suddenly changed his schedule. He ordered his train to travel non-stop, bypassing scheduled halts where the assassins might have been waiting. He arrived back in Beijing on the evening of September 12, 1971, safe behind the walls of the leadership compound. The plot had failed. When news reached the Lin family that Mao had returned to the capital, they panicked. They realized that the security services would soon uncover the conspiracy. On the night of September 12th, at the seaside resort of Beidai, where the family was staying, a chaotic scene unfolded. Lin Biao, his wife Ye Krun, and his son Lin Liguo commandeered a vehicle and raced toward the local naval airfield at Shanhaiguan. In their haste, they smashed through the airport security barrier. They boarded a British-made Trident II-56 jet belonging to the Air Force. The plane took off in such a rush that the co-pilot, navigator, and radio operator were left behind on the tarmac. Even more critically, the aircraft had not been fully refueled. The plane headed north. The flight path suggests that Lin Biao was attempting to defect to the Soviet Union. For the closest comrade in arms of Chairman Mao to flee to the hated revisionist enemy was the ultimate betrayal. Back in Beijing, the government tracked the aircraft on radar. Premier Zhou Enlai was informed. There was a discussion about whether to shoot the plane down, but Mao reportedly waved his hand and said, "Rain will fall, widows will remarry, let him go." At 2:30 in the morning on September 13, 1971, the Trident jet ran out of fuel over Mongolia. The pilot attempted an emergency landing in the vast steppe near the city of Undorkan. The landing gear was not deployed, likely to prevent the plane from flipping on the rough terrain. The aircraft belly flopped onto the ground, skidded, and broke apart, exploding into a ball of fire. There were no survivors. For several weeks, the Chinese public was told nothing. The National Day Parade on October 1st was abruptly cancelled without explanation. Rumours swirled. Finally, the government released the news. Lin Biao had died after a failed coup attempt. The impact of this revelation on the Chinese psyche was devastating. For 5 years, the people had been told that Lin Biao was the model revolutionary. He was the high priest of the Mao cult. His introduction to the Little Red Book was memorized by every citizen. Now, the government was claiming that this man was a traitor, a counter-revolutionary, and a would-be assassin. If Lin Biao was a villain, what did that say about the chairman who had chosen him? What did it say about the Cultural Revolution itself? For many true believers, particularly the young Red Guards who were now languishing in the countryside, the Lin Biao incident was the moment the spell broke. The ideological fervor began to drain away, replaced by cynicism and exhaustion. The death of Lin Biao marked the psychological end of the Cultural Revolution, even if the political struggle would drag on for another 5 years. The myth of Mao's infallibility had crashed and burned in the Mongolian desert. Part 5. The Twilight of the Chairman. Following the death of Lin Biao in September 1971, the political landscape of the People's Republic underwent a quiet but significant transformation. The revelation that the chairman's hand-picked successor had plotted a coup destroyed the ideological purity that had driven the Cultural Revolution. The party was left in a state of shock, and the day-to-day administration of the country was in tatters. Millions of cadres were still in labor camps, the universities were non-functional, and the army's loyalty was now suspect. Into this vacuum stepped Premier Zhou Enlai. Zhou had spent the previous 5 years navigating the chaos, protecting what he could of the state apparatus. With Lin Biao gone and Mao Zedong's health beginning to decline, Zhou persuaded the chairman that the country needed competent management to prevent economic collapse. To achieve this, Zhou began a process of rehabilitation, bringing back the experienced officials who had been purged during the early years of the revolution. The most prominent of these returnees was Deng Xiaoping. Deng had been labelled the number 2 capitalist roader in 1966 and had spent the intervening years working in a tractor repair factory in Jiangxi province. In 1973, with Zhou Enlai suffering from advanced bladder cancer, Deng was recalled to Beijing. He was reinstated as vice premier and eventually took over the daily running of the government and the military. Deng Xiaoping wasted no time. He was a pragmatist who had little patience for the endless political slogans that had paralyzed the nation. He famously declared that the army no longer needed to be swollen and that industry needed to focus on production rather than revolution. He targeted the railway system, which was plagued by factional fighting and delays, ordering the arrest of disruptive rebel leaders. Under Deng's heavy hand, the trains began to run on time, and the economy showed signs of recovery. However, this shift towards stability infuriated the radical faction within the Politburo. This group was led by Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, and included the Shanghai polemicist Yao Wenyuan, the worker rebel Wang Hongwen, and the theorist Zhang Chunqiao. Later, Mao himself would disparagingly label them the Gang of Four, a name that history would adopt. The Gang of Four controlled the media, the culture, and the propaganda apparatus. They viewed Deng Xiaoping's reforms as a right deviationist wind that sought to reverse the verdict of the Cultural Revolution. Since they could not attack Deng or Zhou Enlai directly due to their popularity and Mao's protection, they resorted to the traditional Chinese method of attacking the present by criticizing the past. In 1974, the Gang of Four launched the Criticize Lin, Criticize Confucius campaign. On the surface, this movement seemed illogical. It linked the disgraced communist general Lin Biao with the ancient philosopher Confucius, who had died 2,500 years earlier. The state media was filled with articles denouncing Confucius for wanting to restore the old rights of the Zhou dynasty. To the politically astute citizens of China, the subtext was obvious. The Duke of Zhou, who wanted to restore the old order, was a thinly veiled reference to Premier Zhou Enlai. The attacks on Confucian moderation were attacks on Zhou's administrative policies. The campaign was a battle for the soul of the party. The Gang of Four wanted permanent revolution, while Zhou and Deng wanted modernization and stability. As this political struggle waged in the newspapers, the physical health of the protagonists deteriorated. Mao Zedong was suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, which gradually robbed him of his ability to speak and move. He became increasingly dependent on his secretaries to interpret his grunts and nods. Meanwhile, Zhou Enlai's cancer was terminal. By 1975, Zhou was confined to a hospital bed, leaving Deng Xiaoping to fight the political battles alone. The tension reached its breaking point on January 8, 1976, when Premier Zhou Enlai died. Zhou was a complex figure, but to the Chinese public he represented sanity and protection. He was viewed as the benevolent grandfather who had softened the harsh blows of Mao's policies. His death triggered a massive outpouring of genuine grief that terrified the Gang of Four. Jiang Qing and her allies feared that the mourning for Zhou would turn into a political demonstration against them. They issued a series of restrictive orders. They banned the wearing of black armbands. They forbade public memorial meetings. They ordered the media to downplay the coverage of the funeral. On January 11th, the day Zhou's body was transported from the hospital to the Babailshan Revolutionary Cemetery for cremation, the people defied these orders. Over 1 million citizens lined Chang'an Avenue in freezing temperatures. They stood in silence as the hearse passed, many weeping openly. This event was a silent vote of no confidence in the radical leadership. The suppression of grief turned into anger 3 months later during the Qingming Festival, or the Tomb Sweeping Festival. This is the traditional time when Chinese families visit the graves of their ancestors to clean them and offer spirits. In early April 1976, the citizens of Beijing began to gather in Tiananmen Square. Since Zhou Enlai had no grave, his ashes had been scattered across the rivers and mountains of China in accordance with his will. The people turned the monument to the people's heroes in the center of the square into a makeshift shrine. Thousands of people arrived carrying paper wreaths, white flowers, and poems written in calligraphy. The wreaths stacked up until they formed mountains of paper flowers surrounding the monument. The poems pasted onto the stones were ostensibly eulogies for Zhou, but many contained sharp, allegorical attacks on Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four. One famous poem read, "In our grief we hear the devils shrieking, we weep while wolves and jackals laugh." By April 4th, the crowd in the square had swelled to 2 million people. It was the largest spontaneous gathering in the history of the People's Republic. The Gang of Four watched from the Great Hall of the People on the edge of the square with growing panic. They convinced the ailing Mao Zedong that this was not a memorial but a counter-revolutionary incident, orchestrated by Deng Xiaoping to seize power. On the night of April 4th, the authorities made their move. They sent in the police and the militia to clear the square. The wreaths and poems were removed and burned. When the protesters returned on the morning of April 5th to find the shrine destroyed, the situation turned violent. The crowd burned police vehicles and stormed a nearby government building. The state responded with force. The militia, armed with wooden clubs, surrounded the square and beat the remaining protesters into submission. Thousands were arrested. This event, known as the First Tiananmen Incident, had immediate political consequences. The Gang of Four used the riot to settle the score with their rival. They presented Mao with reports claiming that Deng Xiaoping was the black hand behind the unrest. Mao, who had always prioritized the stability of the party over the economy, sided with the radicals. On April 7, 1976, the Central Committee issued a resolution stripping Deng Xiaoping of all his leadership positions. For the second time in 10 years, Deng was purged. However, crucially, he was allowed to keep his party membership and he was not expelled from Beijing. He was placed under house arrest, protected by sympathetic military commanders who ensured that the Gang of Four could not physically harm him. With Deng out of the picture, the question of succession was reopened. Mao Zedong did not trust the Gang of Four to run the country. He knew they were unpopular and lacked administrative skill. Yet, he could not hand power to the rightists. He chose a compromise candidate, Hua Guofeng. Hua Guofeng was a relatively obscure official from Mao's home province of Hunan. He was loyal, uncharismatic, and politically neutral. Mao appointed Hua as the first vice-chairman and premier, effectively designating him as the heir apparent. Mao reportedly gave Hua a handwritten note that read, "With you in charge, I'm at ease." By the summer of 1976, the Chinese political system was in a state of suspended animation. The chairman was dying. The premier was new and untested. The radicals were controlling the media but were despised by the military and the public. The moderates were waiting in the wings, protecting Deng Xiaoping. The atmosphere was heavy with the expectation of a final showdown. The country was exhausted. 10 years of constant revolution, of friends turning on friends, of children denouncing parents, and of factional warfare had left the population cynical and weary. The economy was stagnant, and the education system remained broken. The belief in the utopia promised in 1966 had long since evaporated, replaced by a grim struggle for survival. As the summer heat descended on Beijing, the entire nation waited for the inevitable news that would signal the end of the era, the death of the man who had started it all. Part 6. The End of an Era. In the summer of 1976, the atmosphere in China was thick with political tension and superstitious dread. In traditional Chinese culture, it is believed that major natural disasters are omens, indicating that the emperor has lost the mandate of heaven and that a dynastic change is imminent. On July 28, 1976, the earth itself seemed to confirm that the era of Mao Zedong was ending. At 3:42 in the morning, a massive earthquake struck the industrial city of Tangshan, located just 100 miles east of Beijing. The quake, measuring 7.8 on the Richter scale, obliterated the city. Because it struck while the population was sleeping, the casualty rate was horrific. The official death toll was later released as 242,000 people, though many international observers estimate the true figure was likely 3 times higher. It remains one of the deadliest earthquakes in recorded history. The tremors were so powerful that they were felt in Beijing. The walls of the leadership compound in Zhongnanhai cracked, forcing the ailing Mao Zedong to be moved to a secure facility known as Building 202. While the People's Liberation Army rushed to dig survivors out of the rubble, the radical leadership, the Gang of Four, made a fatal political error. They declared that the relief effort must not distract from the criticism of Deng Xiaoping. They issued slogans stating that the revolution was more important than earthquake relief. This callousness alienated them even further from the general public and the military, who were working tirelessly in the ruins. 6 weeks later, the second shoe dropped. On September 9, 1976, just after midnight, Mao Zedong died at the age of 82. The announcement was broadcast to the nation at 4 o'clock that afternoon. For the vast majority of the Chinese population, this was a moment of profound uncertainty. Mao had ruled the People's Republic since its inception in 1949. He was the only leader most people had ever known. He was not just a head of state, he was the center of a personality cult that bordered on religion. As the nation entered a period of mandatory mourning, a vicious power struggle erupted behind the scenes. The conflict was between 2 camps. On one side was the Gang of Four, led by Mao's widow, Jiang Qing. They controlled the propaganda apparatus, the newspapers, and the urban militias in Shanghai. They sought to continue the radical policies of the Cultural Revolution. Opposing them was Hua Guofeng, the designated successor who held the titles of Premier and First Vice Chairman. Hua was a moderate who was supported by the military leadership and the old guard of the party bureaucracy. The Gang of Four viewed Hua as weak and temporary. They began to fabricate quotes from Mao, publishing articles in the People's Daily, claiming that Mao's final instruction was to act according to past principles, code for continuing the purge of moderates. The Gang of Four prepared for a coup. They ordered their militia supporters in Shanghai to distribute weapons. They tried to cut off Hua Guofeng's access to the media. However, they underestimated Hua, and, critically, they underestimated the military. Hua Guofeng formed a secret alliance with 2 powerful figures, Marshal Yi Jianying, the senior leader of the military, and Huang Dongxing, the commander of Unit 8341. Unit 8341 was the elite Praetorian Guard responsible for the security of the top leadership. By securing the loyalty of the bodyguards, Hua Guofeng controlled the physical space of Zhongnanhai. The trap was sprung on October 6, 1976, less than a month after Mao's death. Hua Guofeng and Marshal Ye summoned the members of the Standing Committee to a meeting at the Huaran Hall in the leadership compound. The stated agenda was to discuss the publication of Volume 5 of Mao's selected works, a topic that would require the presence of the party's ideologues. Wang Hongwen, the young worker rebel who had risen to power during the Shanghai storms, arrived first. As he entered the hall, he was immediately apprehended by the guards of Unit 8341. Wang attempted to fight back, rushing at Marshal Ye Jianying before being tackled, handcuffed, and dragged away. Zhang Chunqiao, the radical theorist, arrived next. He realized the situation immediately and submitted to arrest without resistance. Yao Wenyuan, the propagandist, was not a member of the Standing Committee and was arrested separately at his home. The most delicate operation was the arrest of Jiang Qing. She was detained in her residence within Zhongnanhai. When the unit commander read the order for her arrest, she reportedly flew into a rage, screaming at the soldiers and demanding to know who gave them the authority to touch the widow of the chairman. She was taken into custody and imprisoned in the Qincheng prison, the same facility where she had sent so many of her rivals over the previous decade. The news of the arrests was not released immediately. For days, the country held its breath, sensing a shift but knowing nothing for certain. The government began to brief officials in stages. When the news finally filtered down to the public that the Gang of Four had been smashed, the reaction was euphoric. In Beijing and Shanghai, liquor stores sold out of alcohol as people celebrated. The citizens purchased crabs, specifically 3 male crabs and 1 female crab, which they boiled and ate. The symbolism was a pun. The Chinese word for crab sounds similar to the word for bully, and eating the crab symbolized the devouring of the 4 tyrants. The arrest of the Gang of Four marked the official end of the Cultural Revolution. However, the path forward was not immediately clear. Hua Guofeng attempted to rule by clinging to the past. He promulgated a policy known as the 2 whatevers. Whatever policy Chairman Mao decided upon, we shall resolutely defend. Whatever instructions the chairman issued, we shall steadfastly obey. This dogmatism quickly proved unsustainable. The country was exhausted and demanded change, not a continuation of the Maoist era without Mao. This environment allowed for the second return of Deng Xiaoping. Deng, who had been living under house arrest since the Tiananmen incident in April, still commanded immense loyalty within the army and the bureaucracy. Throughout 1977 and 1978, Deng outmaneuvered Hua Guofeng. He rallied support for a new program based on reform and opening up. He argued that the criterion for truth should be practice, not ideology. By December 1978, at the 3rd plenary session of the 11th Central Committee, Deng Xiaoping effectively became the paramount leader of China. Hua Guofeng was slowly eased out of power, stripped of his titles one by one, until he retired into obscurity. To close the book on the Cultural Revolution, the new leadership realized they needed a public reckoning. In 1980, the government staged a televised show trial of the Gang of Four. It was a spectacle watched by millions. Jiang Qing remained defiant to the end. While her co-defendants confessed and expressed repentance, Jiang Qing shouted at the judges. She famously declared, "I was Chairman Mao's dog. Whomever he told me to bite, I bit." Her defense was that she had merely executed the will of the great helmsman. She challenged the court to dare to judge Mao himself. The party, however, had already decided how to handle Mao's legacy. In 1981, the Central Committee passed a resolution on party history. It rendered a verdict that Mao Zedong was 70% good, 30% bad. It acknowledged that he had made gross mistakes during the Cultural Revolution, but affirmed his status as a great revolutionary leader. This formulation allowed the party to maintain its legitimacy while dismantling Mao's policies. Jiang Qing was sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment. She committed suicide in prison in 1991. The decade of the Cultural Revolution left deep scars on the Chinese nation. The education of an entire generation had been interrupted. The Red Guards, the lost generation, found themselves in middle age without degrees or skills, struggling to adapt to the new market economy. The traditional culture of China had been physically smashed, creating a spiritual vacuum that the pursuit of wealth rushed to fill. Trust between citizens had been eroded. People who had been denounced by their neighbors or tortured by their students carried those memories into the new era. Yet, from this devastation, China pivoted with remarkable speed. The rejection of the chaos of 1966 to 1976 provided the political mandate for the rapid economic modernization that followed. The Cultural Revolution began as an attempt to purify the soul of the revolution. It ended by inoculating the country against radical ideology for decades to come. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.